The M4 Sherman was more than a tank. It was a 30-ton declaration of American industrial philosophy. In the sprawling, deafening factories of Detroit and the heavy locomotive works of Ohio, a narrative was being forged in steel, that the Second World War would be won by the arsenal of democracy. The American expectation was clear. They, and they alone, held the secret to victory. It was a formula of standardized parts, relentless assembly lines, and a belief that quality and quantity were not mutually exclusive. They believed they were the undisputed masters of mass production. They were not prepared for the reality of the Eastern Front. In this war, battles were won not just by bullets, but by logistics. Now let us return to the sprawling assembly halls of the American heartland. The sheer scale of the American effort was difficult to comprehend. The Detroit tank arsenal, built by Chrysler, was a river of steel. It was a place where raw armor plate entered one end and finished M4 Shermans rolled out the other, often at a rate of hundreds per month from that single facility. Added to this were the efforts of Ford, General Motors, and the locomotive builders like Lima and Baldwin. They did not just build tanks, they applied the ruthless efficiency of automotive manufacturing to the tools of war. The Sherman itself was a product of this thinking. It was designed for reliability. Its Wright R975 radial engine, an aircraft engine adapted for ground use, was a testament to American power and precision. Its components were standardized to an obsessive degree, allowing for field repairs using parts cannibalized from other wrecked vehicles. American planners and engineers glowed with pride at this achievement. They had created a good enough tank that could be produced in overwhelming numbers. For the American tanker climbing into his M4 in 1943, the machine felt sturdy. It felt finished. The interior, while cramped by any civilian standard, was a world away from the agricultural roughness of other designs. The seats were padded. The controls were ergonomic. The main gun's gyro stabilizer allowed for a crude but effective form of firing on the move, a technological luxury that baffled their allies. The welds holding the armor plates together were clean, uniform, and inspected with microscopic precision. This was a product of a nation that valued its crews and believed that a comfortable, less fatigued crew was a more effective one. This philosophy stood in stark contrast to what they knew of their enemy. German tanks like the Tiger and the Panther were technological marvels, but they were also finicky, over-engineered, and slow to build. American commanders looked at the production figures and felt a surge of confidence. For every one Tiger the Germans painstakingly assembled, America could flood the field with a dozen Shermans. The math seemed undeniable. Victory was a simple equation of attrition, and America was the only nation capable of paying the industrial price. This belief system permeated the entire chain of command, from the logisticians in Washington, D.C., to the ordnance officers in the field. They were the undisputed industrial giants. They had perfected the art of the assembly line, a gift they had given to the modern world, and now that same invention was being turned to save it. The M4 Sherman, in all its standardized, reliable, mass-produced glory, was the proof. They were building tanks faster than anyone in history, and they were building them well. The war, from this perspective, was already won. It was just a matter of time. The American Titan was awake, its muscles moving with a rhythm of riveting guns, humming engines, and the clatter of tank treads on the factory floor. They were the standard bearers of modern warfare. They believed, with complete and total conviction, that no other nation on earth, friend or foe, could possibly match this combination of quality, speed, and overwhelming scale. This unshakable faith in their own industrial supremacy was the foundation of their entire war strategy. It was a foundation that was about to be fractured by whispers from the east. The first reports were faint, easily lost in the static of a global conflict. They came not from American troops, but from their defeated enemy. German after-action reports, captured by British intelligence in North Africa and later by American forces in Italy, began to paint a picture of the Eastern Front that was profoundly disturbing. It was a different kind of war, a war of annihilation fought on a scale that dwarfed the encounters in the West. And in these reports, one designation appeared with chilling frequency: T-34. To the American ordnance officers reading the translations, the language was baffling. It lacked the clinical detachment they expected from German analysis. Instead, the reports were laced with a raw, primal fear. They spoke of T-34 shock. T-34 shock, a term coined by Wehrmacht infantry who had watched their anti-tank guns fire round after round, only to see the shells spark and deflect harmlessly off a radically sloped glacis plate. German tank commanders, men who had conquered Europe in their Panzer IIIs and IVs, described encounters that defied their understanding of armored warfare. They told of engaging a new Soviet tank that was not just well-armored, but fast. It did not lumber. It surged across the battlefield. Its wide tracks, designed for the bottomless mud and crushing snow of the Russian steppe, gave it a mobility in terrain that turned German panzers into steel coffins. Where the meticulously engineered German tanks bogged down, the T-34 seemed to float. Then there was its gun. The Soviet 76.2 cannon was a crude but powerful weapon that could punch through the frontal armor of a Panzer IV at ranges where the German gunners could only watch, frantically traversing their turrets, waiting to get close enough to return effective fire. The reports were consistent. The T-34 was a monster. It was a machine that rendered their best tactics, and in many cases their best equipment, obsolete overnight. In Washington and at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, these initial whispers were met with skepticism. It sounded like battlefield hyperbole, the excuses of defeated commanders. The prevailing image of the Soviet Union was one of agrarian backwardness, of a regime that had purged its own officer corps and relied on human wave attacks, not technological innovation. How could a nation that, by American estimates, lacked the sophisticated industrial base for something like automotive manufacturing, create a world-beating tank? This skepticism was a form of self-preservation. It protected the core belief, described earlier, that America was the unrivaled arsenal of democracy. The M4 Sherman was the logical product of the world's most advanced industrial culture. This, T-34, was an anomaly. It was a ghost story from a frozen hell, a place that had little in common with the clean war of production figures and standardized parts that American logisticians understood. But the ghost stories multiplied. The whispers became a roar. As the Wehrmacht's offensive stalled and then catastrophically reversed at Stalingrad and Kursk, the T-34 was no longer a rumor. It was the principal instrument of the Wehrmacht's destruction on the Eastern Front. Military attachés and Lend-Lease administrators operating out of Moscow began sending their own, more sober confirmations. They had seen the T-34s. They had seen them assembled, seen them rolling in endless columns toward the front. The Soviets were not just building a good tank. They were building them in numbers that defied comprehension. This was the true source of the shock. It was not just that the TDE-34 was a brilliant design. It was that the Soviets were mass-producing it. This struck at the very heart of America's strategic confidence. The Americans believed they had a monopoly on mass production. They believed their M4 Sherman was the ultimate expression of that craft. Now they were faced with the terrifying possibility that another nation, an ally they viewed as primitive, had not only matched them but had done so under the most brutal conditions imaginable. The Soviet tank was a machine built without a shred of comfort for its crew. It was a tool designed for a single purpose, to meet the enemy and destroy him, and to be produced in numbers so vast that individual losses were meaningless. This philosophy was as alien to the American mind as the sloped armor itself. The M4 Sherman was built to win the war. The T-34, the report suggested, was built simply to endure it, to grind the enemy down through sheer, unimaginable attrition. The ordnance men in Maryland were no longer just curious. They were desperate. The whispers and reports were not enough. They needed to see one. They needed to touch it, to measure its steel, to understand the mind that had conceived it. The T-34 was no longer just a German problem. It was a riddle that the American military had to solve. And in late 1943, a prized specimen, a battle-scarred T-34 model 1941, captured by the Germans and then recaptured by the Allies, was quietly loaded onto a freighter, destined for Aberdeen proving ground. The dissection was about to begin. When the crated T-34 model 1941 finally arrived at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, it was treated as a captured curiosity. The engineers and ordnance experts who gathered for its uncrating were the high priests of American industrial design. They were men who lived by the micrometer, who understood the precise tolerances of gears, the tensile strength of steel, and the art of the clean weld. They were building the most sophisticated war machine in history, and they were proud of it. As the T-34 was rolled onto the testing field, parked near a gleaming new M4A3 Sherman, the initial reaction was one of quiet, almost arrogant, dismissal. The Soviet tank was hideous. This was not an exaggeration. It was a professional assessment. Where the Sherman had clean vertical lines and precise robotic welds, the T-34 was a brute. Its armor plates were joined by thick, sloppy seams of bubbled, uneven welding that would have gotten an American factory worker instantly fired. The cast turret was rough, pockmarked with imperfections. The gaps between the armor plates were uneven, in some places wide enough to see shims jammed into place. It looked less like a product of a modern factory and more like something hammered together in a village smithy. It was agricultural. It was primitive. Then, the dissection began, and the horror set in. The first discovery was the armor itself. The engineers put their gauges on the frontal glacis plate. It was not significantly thicker than the Sherman's, but its angle was revolutionary. The plate was sloped back at a severe 60 degrees, a simple geometric trick that had profound implications. A shell striking the plate would be far more likely to ricochet, glancing harmlessly off into the sky. And even if it did not deflect, the shell would have to penetrate a much greater effective thickness of steel. This single design choice, so simple and yet so brilliant, was responsible for the T-34 shock the Germans had described. Next, they turned their attention to the running gear. The T-34 lacked the Sherman's sophisticated vertical volute suspension system, which gave the American tank a relatively smooth ride. Instead, it used a Christie suspension, a system of large road wheels on long coil springs that the American Army itself had experimented with and abandoned. But the real shock was the tracks. They were massive, wide, and simple. They were raw, cast steel, with no rubber pads or complex pins. The engineers realized these tracks were the key to the T-34's mobility. They were designed to spread the tank's 26-ton weight over a huge area, giving it a ground pressure so low it could float over the deep mud and snow that swallowed German panzers whole. The exterior was a paradox, crude execution of a brilliant concept. The interior, however, was a pure, unadulterated nightmare. When the chief inspector lowered himself through the hatch, he was not entering a fighting vehicle. He was entering a steel coffin. There was no padding. There was no paint. Bare metal, sharp edges, and exposed wiring were everywhere. The crew seats were simple steel pans. The driver's controls were two crude levers and a set of pedals. The transmission was the most shocking part. The engineers discovered it was a simple, brutalist gearbox that was notoriously difficult to shift. Reports from the Eastern Front, which they had dismissed as propaganda, were suddenly confirmed. Soviet drivers often had to use a hammer to force the tank into gear. An American tanker, used to his smooth synchro-mesh transmission, would have refused to operate such a machine. But this, the Aberdeen men realized, was the point. The Soviets had not failed to build a good transmission. They had chosen not to. They had accepted a terrible, crew-fatiguing flaw because perfecting it would have slowed down the assembly line. Then they opened the engine bay. All derision vanished. Inside sat a machine that was, by any standard, a masterpiece. It was a 12-cylinder, 500-horsepower diesel engine, and it was made almost entirely of aluminum. This V2 engine was light, powerful, and fuel-efficient. Its use of diesel fuel made it far less prone to catching fire than the Sherman's gasoline engine, a terrifying flaw that had earned the M4 the grim nickname Ronson. For the Soviets to dedicate a strategic resource like aluminum to a tank engine was a sign of incredible foresight. The engineers stepped back, their minds reeling. They were looking at a machine that defied every principle of American manufacturing. The M4 Sherman was built for its crew. It was designed for comfort, for safety, and above all, for repair. Its parts were standardized and interchangeable. The T-34 was not built for its crew. It was built for the factory. It was designed to be produced by an unskilled labor force, to be hammered together and thrown into the fight. Its parts were not interchangeable. If a T-34 broke down, it was often easier to abandon it and get a new one. The Aberdeen report was a document of profound cognitive dissonance. It praised the T-34 as having outstanding armor, excellent mobility, and a remarkable engine. In the same breath, it condemned its appalling construction, crude finish, and unacceptable crew conditions. The engineers were horrified because they had finally understood the philosophy. The Soviets were not in a contest of quality. They were in a war of annihilation. The T-34 was the ultimate expendable asset, a tool built to be lost, a weapon that valued speed of production above the very lives of the men inside it. The secret that chilled the Aberdeen engineers to the bone was not a matter of metallurgy or mechanical design. It was a glimpse into a terrifyingly alien philosophy of war. The crude welds and rough, pockmarked armor of the T-34 were not a sign of Soviet inability to do better. They were a sign of their refusal to do so. It was a conscious decision, a ruthless calculation that valued time, and only time, above all else. Every sloppy weld, every unfiled sharp edge inside the crew compartment, every unpainted surface represented a few saved minutes on the assembly line. And when those minutes were multiplied by tens of thousands of tanks, they translated into entire armored corps appearing at the front weeks ahead of schedule. This philosophy was a direct reflection of the workforce that built it. American tank production, centered in Detroit, was powered by the world's most skilled industrial labor force, men who had spent decades perfecting the art of automobile manufacturing, men who understood precision and took pride in a clean weld, were now applying that same craft to the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was, in essence, a high-quality consumer product built for a military purpose. It was designed to be reliable, serviceable, and as safe as a 30-ton box of steel and high explosives could be. The Soviet workforce was a different entity entirely. As the Wehrmacht punched deep into Russian territory, the factories were the front line. The skilled male laborers were, by necessity, in the army. The assembly lines of Tankograd were run by women, teenagers, and old men who had been pulled from farms and villages. They were not trained mechanics. They were patriots working in unheated open-air factories in the dead of a Siberian winter. They were often starving, working 12-hour shifts until they collapsed. The T-34 was designed for them. It was a machine that could be built by a desperate, unskilled, and exhausted population. It did not require precision. It did not require finesse. One did not need to be a master welder to join its plates. One simply needed to melt the steel until it stuck. The result was ugly, but it was strong enough. The Christie suspension was simple to bolt on. The V2 engine was a complex marvel, but it was built as a single, replaceable unit. This was the genius of the design. It separated the one complex component, the engine, from the brutally simple chassis. For the American crew, this translated into a vehicle that was, by their standards, borderline unusable. The lack of a turret basket was a prime example. In an M4 Sherman, the gunner and commander stood on a platform that rotated with the turret. In the T-34, they stood on the hull floor. When the turret traversed, the commander had to physically scramble over the spent shell casings and follow the gun, or be crushed by the rotating breech. The loader had to perform a dangerous, exhausting ballet, grabbing 76.2 millimeter shells while dodging the tank's internal mechanisms. The optics were another nightmare. The Sherman's periscopes and gun sights were clear, reliable, and gave the crew a good, if limited, view of the outside world. The T-34's optics were notoriously poor, often cloudy and easily damaged. This forced Soviet tank commanders to do the one thing a tanker should never do: ride with their head and torso fully exposed through the open hatch, using binoculars to find the enemy. The life expectancy of a T-34 commander was, as a result, horrifically short. But the most brutal feature was the transmission. The Aberdeen engineers' report on the difficulty of shifting was a clinical understatement. For the Soviet driver, it was a source of constant, agonizing labor. Shifting gears required enormous physical strength, and drivers famously kept a small sledgehammer next to their seat to physically beat the gear lever into place. This was not a flaw that was missed by designers, it was a trade-off that was accepted. To build a synchro-mesh gearbox, like the one in the Sherman, would have required precision gear-cutting machines and skilled workers, both of which were in critically short supply. The Soviet solution was to build a crude, crash gearbox and simply transfer the burden of its flaw from the factory floor to the end user, the driver. The T-34 was, therefore, a weapon that actively fought its own crew. It fatigued them, it injured them, and it offered them almost no protection from the elements. But it did one thing exceptionally well. It kept coming. The crude, wide tracks that clattered and screeched did not break. The simple cast steel road wheels did not shatter. The diesel engine, even when poorly maintained, would start in the deepest Russian frost. The tank was an unstoppable beast because it was crude. It was the physical manifestation of a state that had calculated the human cost of victory and had prepaid it in the suffering of its own crews. The Americans were stunned because they were looking at a tank built without a shred of compromise. Every luxury, including basic safety and human comfort, had been sacrificed on the altar of production speed. The T-34 was not just a tank, it was a terrifyingly clear message. The Soviet Union was willing to endure a level of brutality, both in the factory and on the field, that America could barely comprehend. The American industrial miracle that produced the M4 Sherman was, at its heart, a miracle of construction. When the nation mobilized, it built new, sprawling, state-of-the-art facilities like the Detroit Tank Arsenal. It converted the world's most advanced automotive plants, harnessing the existing genius of Ford's River Rouge and Chrysler's vast workshops. The arsenal of democracy was built upon the solid peacetime foundation of the world's wealthiest nation. It was an additive process. It was a matter of building, converting, and hiring. The Soviet miracle, the machine that produced the T-34, was a miracle of exodus. It was an act of impossible, brutal relocation. When the German panzers stormed across the border in June 1941, they were not just aiming for Moscow, they were aiming for the heart of Soviet industry, Leningrad, the Donbass region, and Kharkiv. The Kharkiv Komintern locomotive plant, the primary birthplace of the T-34, was directly in the path of the German advance. The Soviet High Command, Stavka, was faced with a choice that no American planner could even conceive. Allow their entire industrial base to be captured, or move it. They chose to move it. What followed was one of the largest and most desperate industrial migrations in human history. It was not a matter of moving blueprints or retooling a safe factory in the interior. It was a matter of physically disassembling everything. Giant, multi-ton stamping presses, massive lathes, blast furnaces, gear cutters, and thousands of precision machine tools were unbolted from their concrete foundations, often while German artillery was already beginning to find the range. This colossal weight of machinery was dragged to railheads and loaded onto thousands of open-air flatbed cars. Alongside the machines went the workers, not just the engineers, but the laborers, the women, the families. They were packed into cattle cars with whatever meager possessions they could carry. This great disorganized river of steel and humanity then began a journey of over 1,000 miles east, past the Ural Mountains, into the frozen emptiness of Siberia. Their destination was a place that would become a legend, Chelyabinsk, soon to be known as Tankograd, or Tank City. The contrast with the American experience was absolute. While American workers at the Detroit arsenal clocked out and drove home to warm houses, the Soviet workers arrived in a frozen wasteland. There were no factories waiting for them. There was barely any housing. They lived in crude dugouts, in tents, in hastily constructed wooden barracks while temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. And in this frozen hell, they rebuilt their world. The first priority was not shelter. It was the tanks. Eyewitness accounts from Tankograd defy belief. Massive, critical machines, the very ones unbolted from the factory floors in Kharkiv, were unloaded from the rail cars and set down directly onto the frozen, snow-covered ground. With no buildings, no roofs, and no walls, the workers began reassembling their factories in the open air. Women, their hands freezing to the steel, wired the machines together. Teenagers, shivering in thin coats, dug foundations in the permafrost, and in a matter of weeks, before the factory walls were even built, those machines exposed to the Siberian elements were already turning out the first components for T-34s. This was the context for the crude, brutal design that the Aberdeen engineers had dissected. The T-34 was not just designed to be built by an unskilled workforce. It was designed to be built by a displaced, starving, and freezing workforce on machinery that had just been dragged halfway across a continent. The sloppy welds were the frantic, desperate work of a welder trying to join two plates in a blizzard. The rough casting of the turret was the product of a foundry that had been rebuilt from rubble in a matter of days. The American arsenal was a symbol of strength and prosperity. Tankograd was a symbol of pure, unadulterated will. It was a city built from nothing, dedicated to a single purpose, the production of T-34s, regardless of the human cost. While American industry was building its strength, the Soviets were transplanting theirs. They had ripped the heart out of their own country to save it, and in the process, created an industrial base in the wilderness that would soon be outproducing the Third Reich. This act of sheer, desperate survival was something the American planners, with their clean factories and robust supply chains, had never factored into the equation. They were calculating industrial capacity. They had failed to calculate industrial will. The M4 Sherman was a weapon born of a nation that prized its manpower. The American soldier was, by global standards, the most expensive and well-trained in history. He was the product of a massive investment in logistics, training, and equipment. The Sherman was the armored embodiment of this philosophy. It was designed, above all, to be survivable and serviceable. The men who operated it were professionals, and the tank was their tool. This was the American philosophy of steel. Inside the Sherman, an American crewman found a machine built for him. It was cramped, hot, and loud, but it was ergonomic. The driver had a padded seat and a smooth, synchro-mesh transmission that operated with the reliability of a civilian truck. The gunner and commander, perched in the turret basket, rotated with their gun, their eyes pressed to clear, high-quality optics. The tank's gyro stabilizer, while primitive, allowed them to fire with a degree of accuracy while on the move, a feat that was nearly impossible for most of their adversaries. This design philosophy extended to the tank's entire life cycle. The Sherman was built from standardized, interchangeable parts. An M4A3 built by Ford in Michigan could, in theory, swap its engine with an M4A2 built by Fisher. This was the genius of the American system. A tank knocked out on the battlefield was not a permanent loss. It was a recovery and repair job. Behind the front lines, entire divisions of the Ordnance Corps worked tirelessly, cannibalizing wrecks, rebuilding engines and welding patches onto armor. The Sherman was designed to be reborn, time and time again. This philosophy was not without its fatal flaws. The M4's high profile and thin side armor made it a conspicuous target, and its original gasoline engine and dry ammunition stowage earned it the horrific nickname Ronson from its crews, who knew that a solid hit often meant a catastrophic fire. But even this flaw was addressed. The later wet stowage models, which surrounded the ammunition with a water glycol mixture, dramatically increased crew survivability. The system learned. It adapted, because its goal was to protect the men inside. The T-34 was a weapon born of a nation that prized production. The Soviet state, fighting for its very existence, had made a different calculation. The most valuable commodity was not the trained crewman, but the time it took to build one more tank. The T-34 was a machine designed to be expended. It was not a professional's tool. It was a conscript's bludgeon. The interior of the T-34, as dissected at Aberdeen, was a testament to this. It was a crew-hostile environment. There was no turret basket. The commander and loader stood on the hull floor, forced to scramble around the rotating gun breech and hot tumbling shell casings. The driver fought a gearbox that required a hammer to shift. The optics were so poor that commanders were forced to ride with their heads out of the hatch, making them the primary target for every sniper and machine gunner. The tank actively consumed its operators. This design was not a mistake. It was a choice. The T-34 was not built to be repaired. It was built to be replaced. Its parts were not interchangeable. The crude, sloppy welds meant that no two T-34s were exactly alike. A damaged T-34 was often simply abandoned. It was faster to have a new one roll off the lines at Tankograd than to waste precious, skilled man-hours on field repair. The T-34 was, in essence, disposable. The crew was, by extension, also disposable. When American tankers and logisticians finally understood this, it was a profound shock. They were fighting a war of careful, sustainable logistics. They were fighting a war of preservation. The Soviets were fighting a war of total, brutal attrition. The M4 Sherman was a scalpel, designed for a war of maneuver, repair, and skilled operation. The T-34 was a sledgehammer, designed for a war of mass, speed, and overwhelming expendable numbers. The American crews had to accept a sobering reality. Their tanks were, in many ways, technologically superior. They were more comfortable, more reliable, and far more likely to be repaired. But they were facing an enemy and an ally who had embraced a philosophy of war that was almost nihilistic in its simplicity. The Soviets did not care if their tanks were crude. They did not care if their crews were exhausted and battered by their own machines. They only cared that the tide of steel moving west never, ever stopped. For years, the T-34 had been a phantom. It was a terrifying legend from a different war, a beast described in the frantic reports of their shared German enemy. For the American tank crews pushing across Germany in the spring of 1945, the war had been defined by their own M4 Shermans against the technological menace of the Panther and the Tiger. Their war was one of deadly tactical duels. Now, as the Third Reich collapsed, the two great Allied tides were about to meet. The Phantom was about to become real. The link-ups happened at places like Torgau, on the banks of the Elbe River. The American armored divisions that rolled up were a portrait of the arsenal of democracy. Their Shermans were battle-scarred, their olive-drab paint covered in dust and field modifications, but they were fundamentally intact. They were well-maintained. Their crews, weary but victorious, carried themselves with the confidence of men who knew their logistical tale was robust, that a broken part would be replaced, that a hot meal was coming. They were the tip of a spear forged in the clean, efficient factories of Detroit. Then, they heard the sound. It was not the higher-pitched, throat-clearing roar of the Sherman's radial gasoline engine. It was a deep, guttural, ground-shaking thrum. The sound of hundreds of heavy-duty diesel engines moving in unison. And over the rise, the first of them appeared. It was not a platoon. It was not a company. It was a column, stretching back to the horizon. It was a river of steel, and it was flowing west. The American GIs and tankers lined the roads, many climbing onto their own tanks for a better view, and they watched in stunned, profound silence. The T-34s that rolled past were not the factory-fresh model dissected at Aberdeen. These were the survivors. They were monsters. They were caked in the mud and filth of 4 years of total war. Their paint was blistered, scorched, or entirely absent, the bare steel beneath showing through like scar tissue. Crude, chalky white lines, the remnants of winter camouflage, were smeared across their turrets. The sloppy, bubbled welds that had horrified the Aberdeen engineers were now plastered over with even sloppier field welds, where crews had clearly taken plates from wrecked tanks and attached them as crude applique armor. These tanks were not clean. They were weighed down with the detritus of a campaign that had crossed a continent. Spare track links were welded to the frontal glasses. Massive, unditching logs were strapped to their sides. Dozens of external fuel drums were lashed to the engine decks, giving them a range that seemed limitless. They were mobile fortresses, festooned with infantry greatcoats, ammunition boxes, and personal bundles. But the greatest shock was the infantry. They were on the tanks. Dozens of grim-faced Soviet soldiers, part of the descente troops, clung to every available handhold, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes hollow. They were a different kind of soldier, harder, more brutalized by a war the Americans had only seen in glimpses. They looked, as one GI later wrote, like they had come from the end of the world. The American tankers looked at this endless column and then looked at their own M4s. Their Shermans were fighting machines. These T-34s were instruments of a blunt force apocalypse. This was the physical evidence of the philosophy they had failed to grasp. These tanks were not maintained. They were used. They were not repaired. They were endured. They were tools that had been hammered, beaten, and worn down to their absolute essence. And still, they came. The crews themselves were a match for their machines. They were not the neat, uniformed American tankers. The Soviet commanders who stood in their hatches were grimy, often wearing padded telegraika jackets instead of uniforms, their faces etched with an exhaustion that was bone deep. When the Americans waved and offered cigarettes, some Soviets waved back, but the column never slowed. It was a relentless, joyless procession. It had a single, terrible purpose: Berlin. This was the moment the numbers from the factories became a terrifying physical reality. The GIs were not just seeing a tank. They were seeing the result of Tankograd. They were witnessing what it meant to produce 50,000 of a single design. It was a tide. It was a flood of steel that had ground the Wehrmacht to powder. The American tankers finally understood. They had been fighting a war of tactics and technology. The Soviets had been fighting a war of mass, and this endless, battered, unstoppable column was what mass really looked like. The M4 Sherman had been the symbol of American mass production. It was the product of a system that had astonished the world, a system of clean factories, skilled labor, and an endless supply of high-quality materials. It was a system that had, by 1945, buried its German adversaries under a sheer weight of steel. The American tankers, logisticians, and generals had every reason to be proud. They had built the arsenal of democracy, and they believed their formula, a perfect balance of quality, reliability, and overwhelming numbers, was the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. The T-34 did not just challenge this belief, it shattered it. The endless battered columns that the GIs witnessed on the Elbe were a profound re-education. They forced a redefinition of the very term mass production. The American model was, at its heart, an optimistic one. It was rooted in the idea of building better as well as faster. It was about giving a good crew a good tank, a tank that was reliable, serviceable, and survivable. The goal was to win the war efficiently, to preserve the lives of the skilled men who had been trained at great expense. The American system was designed to win a war. The Soviet system, as embodied by the T-34, was built on a far darker and more primal foundation. It was a system designed to survive a war. It was not about efficiency. It was about desperation. It was not about preserving the crew. It was about overwhelming the enemy. The Soviets, particularly after the catastrophes of 1941, had embraced a brutal, simple, and terrifying equation. Quantity was a quality all its own. The crude, sloppy welds, the hammered gearboxes, the nightmarish crew ergonomics. These were not flaws to be corrected. They were the very source of the T-34's strategic victory. Every minute not spent on painting the interior, on building a turret basket, or on grinding a gear to a smooth finish was a minute saved. That minute, multiplied by millions of man-hours in the vast, freezing hell of Tankograd, translated into thousands of extra tanks at the front. It meant that for every Tiger tank the Germans painstakingly built, the Soviets could build 30 T-34s. For the American tanker, his war was often a series of high-stakes duels. He had to be better than his opponent, his gunnery sharper, his tactics smarter. He was stalked by the fear of the superior 88mm gun. The Soviet tanker lived in a different reality. He was part of a tide. His job was not necessarily to outfight the enemy, but simply to show up in numbers so vast that the enemy's guns would run hot, his ammunition would be exhausted, and his panzers would be swamped from every direction. The T-34 was a blunt instrument, and its effectiveness came from being swung relentlessly, without pause, until its target was pulverized. This realization was a sobering, almost frightening capstone to the American victory in Europe. They had won their war decisively, but they now stood face to face with an ally who had won an entirely different and arguably far more brutal conflict. They had proven that a free market, consumer-based economy could be converted into the most powerful and efficient war machine in the world. The Soviets had proven that a totalitarian state, driven by sheer terror and patriotic will, could rip its own industry from the earth and transplant it into a frozen wasteland, creating a war machine that was cruder, more brutal, but in the end, just as decisive. The T-34 was a machine born of a different set of truths. It was a tank that accepted unimaginable sacrifice as a prerequisite for victory. It was a tank that placed the survival of the state above the survival of the soldier and the speed of the factory above the comfort of the crew. For the American crews, stunned into silence on the banks of the Elbe, this was the ultimate lesson. They had been stunned by the T-34's innovative sloped armor. They had been horrified by its crude philosophy. And now they were simply awed by its scale. They were the masters of mass production, but the Soviets, they now understood, were the masters of mass. The T-34 was more than just a successful design. It was a weapon that redefined the very meaning of industrial war. It was a machine that demonstrated with brutal clarity that victory did not always go to the most sophisticated, the most comfortable, or the best engineered. It often went to the most available. The crude, ugly, and expendable T-34, built by a desperate, freezing workforce in the middle of a wasteland, was the tank that broke the back of the Wehrmacht. It proved that a nation's will, when focused into a single, simple, and savage tool, could overcome any technological deficit. Its legacy is not just in the steel that rusted on the battlefields from Moscow to Berlin, but in the terrifying, unshakable lesson that in a total war, the most ruthless philosophy of production is the one that ultimately prevails. And that is why these tales must be told.